A few days ago, I was asked to meet two senior managers at Royal Mail to talk about approaches to building and sustaining a partnership with the CWU. This took me back to the early 1990s when Sir Pat Lowry and I worked together to help Royal Mail find ways to build better relationships with the union and with staff in sorting and delivery offices. It was a great privilege to work with Pat and to learn from him about listening before talking and helping people find their own solutions even when he had planted the idea. He would never take credit for that. I had met him several times before. He always remembered me and somehow seemed to know what I'd been working on and showed interest in it. And ever since I was a student at LSE in 1968, I had admired him. His writing of an EEF paper on what the UK could learn from American approaches to industrial relations, grappling with the curse of piecework at British Leyland, sitting on numerous courts of inquiry, and as chair of ACAS in its most difficult period in the 1980s, let alone his work with the CBI and with the IPM, now CIPD. It's about time somebody wrote a biography of him. What would Sir Pat have made of policymakers' current preoccupation with engagement, I wonder? He would want to know a lot more about it and certainly would not dismiss it as a fad. In his gentle and polite way, he would ask, so what? What are the practical implications, especially for managers? He would undoubtedly have been co-opted to the task forces now being assembled to take the engagement movement forward. He would eschew the so-called guru group. I can see him shaking his head and denying he was ever a guru, but of course he was, and a very fine one. In this lecture, I want to take a close and sometimes critical look at the engagement industry, a term used by some writers for want of ever finding an accepted definition, to try to explain why it's become so popular and the dangers associated with that. To understand the significance of the engagement folk theory, another term used to avoid a definition, we need to unravel the different approaches to engagement and assess their usefulness. The importance of employee engagement only really becomes clear when we look for its antecedents, since these then hint at policy implications and allow a consideration of next steps that are required to promote management action to foster employee engagement. David MacLeod and Nita Clark did a fabulous job in 2009 in their report, based on numerous visits around the country and a trawl of all the available evidence. In the process, they came across more than 50 definitions of engagement and sensibly avoided providing yet another one. Almost a year later, a task force of the great and the good from leading companies, the CBI and the TUC, was established with the Prime Minister's blessing to take the ideas forward, backed by a guru group of consultants and academics. The hope is to generate sufficient enthusiasm to spread the logic of employee engagement into managerial practice as a social movement. As fads go, this has more chance of taking root than most, since it resonates with long recognized principles of effective employment relations. The first substantial paper on the topic was by Kahn in 1990. Interestingly, the topic of engagement in the early days was focused on disengagement, and especially the study of work-based stress and associated problems of sickness and absence and labour turnover. It was only when consulting companies began to promote engagement surveys, which purported to show a link between levels of engagement and employee performance, that attention turned from dysfunctional employees to everyone at work. At the same time, there was a hunt for theories that could explain why some employees appear to be more engaged than others, and what action could be taken to improve the number of fully engaged employees. Employee surveys are now big business, and all the leading consultants and survey companies like Gallup and Morey want their survey work to lead to profitable consulting, advising clients on what action needs to be taken. I've written before about the limitations of relying on engagement surveys. These can be summarised in three ways. There's a tendency to treat the survey in isolation, tick the box, and that's engagement over for the year. There's a pressure to boil down engagement to one summary score, the engagement index, which can then be used in management appraisals, sometimes in a punitive way. And finally, this summary score really does nothing to explain why levels of engagement are what they are. In the main, they relate to organisational commitment, engagement, giving the impression that this is the only or most important type of engagement. Decent engagement surveys will look for evidence of engagement at different levels. The job itself, with co-workers, with customers, with the immediate line manager, and with senior managers, as well as the organisation. This can be very revealing. But in creating an overall score, the tendency is to sum all the objects of engagement together. This means for an employee to be fully engaged, the person has to meet all the requirements. I vividly remember a few years ago interviewing ward managers in 5 NHS acute hospitals. Their level of commitment, a better term than engagement, as I will explain later, to their patients, their co-workers, and to their profession was very high. But most had a low opinion, if not very low opinion, of senior managers and the NHS Trust. They would not show up well in an engagement index, even though they were passionately engaged in their work. I'm not against engagement surveys. Indeed, they can be very powerful as part of a suite of HR and performance metrics, and can throw light on problem areas, for example, variances in labour turnover and customer behaviour. The McLeod report provides some data from the Nationwide Building Society. Some years ago, my team at the University of Bath worked with Nationwide on their data. I presented the findings to a conference of senior regional managers showing the relationship between employee attitudes, labour turnover, and mortgage rates, mortgage sales, implying a causal chain, much in the famous Sears employee-customer profit chain. The conference was electrified. You mean the way we treat employees has a direct relationship with the business? Exactly that. The promise of employee engagement is that it puts the employee centre stage. But what then follows has to be a careful analysis of the factors that lead employees to be engaged. It's all too easy to jump to conclusions. Following the McLeod report, according to Artkin, it appeared that most action focused upon the use of suggestion schemes, recognition awards, and getting employees to buy into corporate values. The attempt to get employees to buy into corporate values is especially worrying since the top is relegated to brand management and employees are viewed in a passive role with engagement seen as something that is driven by the organisation rather than something that is largely under the control of the employees. So what is engagement? It's time to try to get to some sort of definition, hard though it is. One way to do this is to profile the engaged employee. Here's one definition by Rich, Lepine and Crawford. In engagement, organisational members harness their full selves in active, complete work role performances by driving personal energy into physical, cognitive and emotional labours. Engaged individuals are described as being psychologically present, fully there, attentive, feeling, connected, integrated, and focused in their role performances. They're open to themselves and others, connected to their work, focused on their role performance. Wow. I'm not sure I'd like to sit next to such a driven person at a dinner party. And that's not all. It's not just role performance that matters. As well as, according to Macy and Schneider, having feelings of persistence, vigour, energy, absorption, enthusiasm, alertness and pride, the engaged employee will demonstrate initiative, proactively seeking opportunities to contribute, and going beyond what is typically required. And just to emphasize the need to be totally focused, there's clear evidence that participation in outside activities is a negative predictor of engagement. So, Anne-Marie, I'm very sorry that your amateur dramatics is going to ruin your career. And just because you got a chair at De Montfort is neither here nor there. Not surprisingly, we find reference to depletion theories, or the dark side of engagement, where employees who try to do all of the roles are experiencing burnout, health problems, and disengagement. Wellborn identifies 5 core roles which the engaged employee is expected to contribute to: as a job holder, an innovator, a team member, a person with a career, and as an organizational member. These are all areas where employees are expected to exercise their discretionary effort and behavior. This leads her to ask, can leaders expect employees to do more of the non-core roles and still keep doing more of the core role? And are today's organizations asking employees to be super people who go above and beyond in everything, what I used to call in academia being a super don? Is this going beyond in every role? If this going beyond in every role is what engagement means, then we certainly are expecting too much, and dangerously so. Not surprisingly, there are fears that engagement can drive work intensification, with employees coming to expect employees to go the extra mile as a matter of course, with overtime becoming normalized and probably unpaid. Under the definition of engagement as exceptional work attitudes, feelings, and behavior, and note, this must mean it's a minority activity, because otherwise, who do you compare with? You're better than, so you must be in a minority. Average task performance does not typically define engagement, nor does coming to work on time or doing what the boss expects. So says Macy and Schneider. But Newman and Harrison point out in a refreshing paper titled "Been There, Bottled That," good attendance, doing one's job well, and being a good citizen is precisely what it means to be engaged. Using a car driving metaphor, they suggest that to be engaged is to be in gear. And of course, when the engine is not in gear, it's idling, running slowly, and disconnected. What evidence we have of the extent of engagement gives some support to this more sensible approach. In an employee survey in companies belonging to the Engagement Consortium at Kingston Business School, led by Katie Truss, 43% were nearly always engaged, while a third were rarely engaged and never strongly so, the so-called flatliners. 10% were reliable and consistent, while 14% became engaged in episodes while undertaking a particular task. In the civil service, the overall level of engagement, this index again, was 56%. It was seen generally the case that around a third of employees are not engaged or disengaged, with the remainder showing some attributes of engagement. This will vary according to the job performed. Managed professional workers are expected to have higher levels of engagement than those in jobs which emphasize routine efficiency, where there are low levels of involvement and little opportunity for discretionary behavior, often found in frontline service workers in fast food outlets, supermarkets, and high-volume call centers. Psychologists seem to get particularly excited about state engagement, meaning the psychological feelings and emotions of doing the job in terms of involvement, commitment, attachment, and mood. But this is really not much more than the familiar territory of overall job attitude. There's also, rather fascinatingly, trait engagement. Here it seems people with an autotelic personality who are inclined to do something for its own sake rather than specific rewards are more prone to be engaged. This is the managerial wonderland. Mind you, using psychological profiling in the selection might be the answer to bankers' bonuses. getting them to do something for nothing would be a good first step, as other workers going the extra mile seem expected to do. More seriously, it does raise one of the perennial problems with engagement, which can imply that the sort of extra behaviours expected are beyond the scope of most remuneration schemes. What do employees get in return for expending discretionary effort and being engaged? Behavioural engagement is of more interest than work-related attitudes, since this is where engagement is most obviously related to outcomes. These can be seen in job performance, adaptability, lower levels of sickness absence, less labour turnover, as well as more broader behaviours coming under the general heading of organisational citizenship behaviour or pro-social behaviour and voluntary cooperation. Good examples would be taking part in problem-solving groups, helping new starters, and even becoming an employee representative, although sadly I've never seen this in the list of organisational citizenship behaviours. A more useful distinction than state and behavioural engagement relates to the objects of engagement. Engage with what? While it's possible to generate quite a long list covering the job, co-workers, customers, the immediate line manager and senior management, it's more helpful to delineate between job engagement and organisational engagement, in the sense between the immediate and the more remote. When you look at measures used to rate job engagement, you find they are remarkably similar to those used to assess job satisfaction, job involvement and job challenge. Old wine in new bottles. This is not to diminish the validity of job engagement, indeed it adds to it, since these aspects of jobs have been studied exhaustively over half a century or more. It's no surprise to find that according to Sachs, job engagement is associated with a sustainable workload, feelings of choice and control, appropriate recognition and reward, a supportive work community, fairness and justice, and meaningful and valued work. The obvious implications, according to Sachs, are training for line managers and job design interventions to build autonomy, challenge, and variety. How long have we heard that? It's right, but it does little to touch deep-seated problems of job fragmentation and insecurity, let alone intensification. The value of organisational engagement is that it recognises the firm as a social entity, a source of identification beyond the job. This is where I find the notion of organisational commitment more helpful than engagement, since it is of long standing and has been extensively studied. In particular, the distinction between three forms of commitment is valuable. Affective commitment, the one that really concerns us, is the feelings of affection or belonging that a person has towards the organisation and the line manager, and is positively associated with citizenship behaviour. Normative commitment relates to employees, like my nurse managers, who feel they should be and are focused on their job for its social value. Continuance commitment is not really commitment at all in these senses, but refers to people trapped in their organisation since the cost of leaving is too high. They are more likely than others to be disengaged. Alongside organisational commitment is the idea of the psychological contract, an individual's beliefs about the terms of their relationship with the organisation that employs them. Employees reciprocate the kind of treatment they receive from management as the employment relationship unfolds. This is where perceived organisational support, otherwise known as POS, comes in as part of social exchange theory. The argument is that employees who perceive good organisational support in their employment relationship respond with increased trust in management and greater commitment to the organisation. They are more engaged. Trust and commitment can be very valuable, intangible assets for organisations. Sachs reports that perceived organisational support was the only significant predictor of both job and organisational engagement. Let me just repeat that. The only significant predictor of job and organisational engagement was perceived organisational support. while organisational engagement was a much stronger predictor of all of the outcomes than job engagement. He then goes on to assert, managers need to provide employees with resources and benefits that will oblige them to reciprocate in kind with higher levels of engagement. This is a dangerous reduction of social relationships to the level of transactional contracts. You cannot oblige a person to be engaged cognitively, emotionally, and physically. It's something they give and do and feel as part of their work behaviour. A basic tenet of social exchange theory is that relationships evolve over time into trusting, loyal and mutual commitments as long as the parties abide by certain rules of exchange, and engagement is a two-way relationship between the employer and the employee. It's not a short-term fix, and as a psychological contract asserts, it's more often found where people have a more open-ended relational contracts. One logic of this is that people on short-term contracts, like agency staff, and those in closely defined and controlled routine work, are likely to have transactional contracts and be less inclined to become engaged. So what are the antecedents of engagement? Since perceived organisational support is the only significant predictor of both types of engagement, it becomes much easier to hunt for their antecedents. We find ourselves, as specialists in employment relations, on familiar ground at last. There is widespread agreement that fairness, justice, and perceptions of trust are crucial causal influences both at the level of the job, thus drawing attention to the role of the line manager, and at the organisational level where the spotlight falls on top management. Let me start with fairness. In a summary of the available research by the Rutgers Centre for Human Resource Strategy, Castellano focuses upon fairness, and I quote, "When employees feel that they are being treated fairly, they reciprocate through the performance of citizenship behaviours. To be fair, procedures should be applied consistently, be free from bias, ensure accurate information is collected, a mechanism exists to correct mistakes, conforms to standards of ethics and morality, and ensures that the opinions of groups affected are taken into account. Fairness of procedures that determine the amount and distribution of organisational resources are particularly important, as well as favourable treatment from the supervisor. We can recognise this as a statement of good employment relations practice, easily. I'll explore the implications of these prescriptions later, but it's worth adding an extra twist about the sources of fairness. It has long been observed, for example by Tyler and Bladder, that people will still rate a procedure as fair if they had a voice, even if they knew that what they said had little or no influence on the decisions made. Voice has a value beyond its ability to shape decision-making processes and outcomes, a conclusion supported by Farndale in their research in Europe. The problem with fairness, like engagement, is that it can be too vague. The idea of justice in organisations has more bite, since we're able to distinguish four types of justice: distributive, procedural, interactional, and informational. Distributive justice is the perceived fairness of the outcome of a decision, like the distribution of performance-related pay. Procedural justice concerns the way the decision came to be taken, the information collected, the openness of the process, and the extent to which people's views were taken into account. This could be work allocation among team members or the management of redundancy, to give but two examples. Increasingly, procedural justice is linked to interactional justice, the interpersonal quality of the interaction between the employee and the immediate manager or high-level manager and with fellow team members. Thus, procedural justice judgments play a major role in shaping people's reactions to their personal experience, in particular about being treated with respect. Increasingly, procedural justice research focuses on pro-social outcomes such as how to build trust, encourage responsibility and obligation, generate intrinsic motivation and creativity, and stimulates voluntary cooperation. A distinction can be made between the formal quality of decision-making, the informal decision-making process, the formal quality of treatment, and the informal treatment. People focus heavily on issues of procedural justice of their group because they find procedural justice information to be the most useful identity-related information they have about their groups. Group means both the work team and the wider organisation. To be able to identify with something or someone is part of belonging and closely related to affective commitment. Thus, it is argued that procedural justice, intertwined with interactional justice, provides identity security, a rather obscure term for a good job in a good work environment run by a good organisation. The importance of this is that it can provide a realistic meaning to perceived organisational support. In some quarters, perceived organisational support is seen as the employer providing good pay, secure jobs and career opportunities, the classic staple diet of the HR department. But procedural justice points the finger at processes of management, the behaviour of line managers and of senior management, the way they treat people with respect, the transparency of the decision-making processes, and the openness to employee views and voice. The final type of organisational justice is informational. Fuchs and Edwards suggest that the informational justice perceptions are shaped through accounts and explanations provided by organisational authorities about reasons as to why certain procedures were chosen and why certain outcomes were distributed in a certain way. This is central to the generation of trust. Informational justice can be especially important in positively influencing employees' attitudes and behaviour in change initiatives. It flows through to procedural and interactional justice, since accounts and explanations are often provided by middle and lower level managers who will also be involved in taking action at the local level, for example, in a corporate restructuring exercise. It is trust which links the four forms of justice together, especially where there are more open-ended or relational expectations. In an occupational analysis of factors associated with high levels of organisational commitment, the Bath University team, using WERS data, found that trust in management was the dominant factor for each of the major 8 occupations studied. No other factor had the same power, and no other factor was true for all organisations in being positively associated with organisational commitment. Trust, like engagement, is a risk, since it requires hope for the future and expectations of others, especially leaders, that they have the ability to do the right or the best thing, are guided by some principles of benevolence or well-meaning, especially in treating people with respect, have integrity and honesty, and are predictable. This is where we should be worried. It's been suggested by Arkin that there's a growing trust deficit between people at the bottom and the top of organisations, what Sachs calls an engagement gap. The evidence from the Civil Service Engagement Survey of 2010 is not very encouraging. Only just over a third agreed that overall I have confidence in the decisions made by my organisation's senior managers, and an even smaller proportion, 27%, felt that change is managed well in my organisation. As we've already noted, having a voice, even if the decision is not changed, is strongly linked to perceptions of procedural justice. But in the civil service, only 32% agreed that I have an opportunity to contribute my views before decisions are made that affect me. This negativity is shown in the 2011 CIPD Employee Outlook Survey. The survey reports net scores, the proportion of people agreeing with a statement minus those disagreeing. The minus scores with a majority disagreeing, were found in relation to questions about trust in directors, senior managers, having confidence in these top people. There were positives concerning the treatment of employees with respect and having a clear vision of where the organisation was going. But the most negative score by far came in answer to the statement, senior managers, directors consult employees about important decisions. Here the net score was -29. There's one final dimension of engagement which is often neglected. I find it amusing to read the psychology experts in this field suggesting that one potential avenue is whether engagement manifests itself as a property of work groups or teams facilitating the development of a common purpose and cohesiveness. Well, of course it does. You can find references in the literature to collective efficacy, people's shared beliefs in their collective power to produce desired results. This is not simply the sum of efficacy beliefs of individual members, but an emergent group-led activity. Well, fancy that. This is collective engagement where people are recognized as social animals with group dynamics and identities, not the atomized individuals studied by psychologists. This is why we find reference to work climates and organizational culture. As Chris Rees and his colleagues put it, trust in senior managers and strong employee line manager relationships thus constitute key components of the organizational requirement required for engagement to flourish. What about engagement in the recession? I do not yet have a clear impression of what has happened to employee engagement in the recession. It was reported in 2006 that engagement levels in the US were on the decline and there was a deepening disengagement amongst employees today. That's Sachs again. But this was before the financial collapse of 2008. I hope some of you will have views and information you will share with us in a little while. There is some evidence from Ireland where the recession was and remains profound. Bill Roach and his colleagues published a study last year based in the main on surveys and focus groups with HR professionals. The results were not very encouraging. Specific programs for engagement, they report, were not much in evidence, and it has sometimes been necessary to park employee engagement initiatives. In terms of management action, the dominant pattern involved in the main one-way, top-down communication, more intensive work regimes, a new concern to manage underperformance and discipline, and the suspension of profit sharing and performance bonuses, none of which will do much to boost engagement. In terms of best practice identified by HR managers, by far the most prominent was the importance of intensive communication with staff and unions regarding commercial pressures confronted by firms and the responses deemed appropriate. That would fit with informational justice, and it did seem to be a new approach, but it did not include employee voice. In our book, Consultation at Work, Regulation and Practice, to be published in October by OUP, Mark Hall and I have a fascinating case history of an American-owned multinational which early in the recession decided to cut its Welsh plant by 2/3 to move work to lower-cost countries. It had a hybrid staff council where unions represented the manual workers and non-union staff representatives spoke for the administrative and professional staff. The council was closely involved in redundancy and the restructuring plan to a remarkable extent over a long period, including direct communication with the workforce in teams and small groups. We had conducted an employee survey before the Troubles and did so afterwards with those staff that remained on site. The results were startling. How good are management here at seeking employees' views? It went up from 41 to 79%. How good are managers here at keeping their promises? Up from 37 to 77%. How fair are managers? Up from 50 to 76%. Organizational commitments increased from 70 to 90%. One respondent wrote on the survey form The past 14 months have been a huge challenge to the company and its employees. Levels of consultation and communication reached unprecedented levels following the announced closure of 2/3 of the manufacturing operations. Workplace consultation has delivered an amazing result, considering the scale of job cuts, levels of quality, productivity, safety, and attendance all exceeded the average run rate for the previous 2 years. We need a lot more stories with good evidence like this, since too much negativity reduces people's imagination of what might be achieved. In this instance, collective consultation procedures, often ignored by some proponents of the engagement agenda, made a major contribution to boosting levels of employee engagement, even in adverse economic circumstances. We need evidence too on how the work of frontline managers can be improved to provide the basis for building employee engagement and commitment. My colleague Sue Hutchison and I published one a few years ago based on research we did in Selfridges in Manchester. Again, we surveyed employees twice. At the end of the first year survey, the company took the view that the results showed that frontline managers were not providing staff with enough support and attention. For example, they did not meet the employee standards in the company value statement, "I know my opinion and contribution is welcomed." Much training, some weeding out of poor-performing line managers, and the introduction of a development-based appraisal scheme took place. In our second-year survey, organisational commitment had increased substantially, as had people's perceptions of job influence and their views on engagement, and their views on management conduct, especially in responding to suggestions from employees. There's nothing particularly remarkable in these case studies. The key to each is the imagination and foresight. Some senior managers, and in one case a union leader, their foresight to see what was possible and to drive it through in a way that built on fairness, justice and trust, as well as contributing to performance improvements, as it did in both cases. Let me sum up. I don't think it matters that employee engagement is a term capable of many shades of meaning. At its heart are employees' feelings, beliefs, and attitudes concerning their job, their co-workers, the customers, their manager, and concerning the organisation as a whole, and especially the senior management team. We know that if employees believe the organisation and its management at the local and the top level provides support to them as a person with feelings and beliefs about fairness and wanting some development, they are likely to respond with cooperative behaviours of benefit to the firm. The key players are line managers, especially frontline managers, and the top management. While there are limits to how many employees are likely to be engaged or in gear, given the prevalence of bad jobs and the reluctance of some to devote much energy to their job, the overall level of engagement or commitment could grow. Employee engagement is best seen as an outcome of managerial activity to build perceptions of trust, fairness, and organisational justice, especially procedural and interactional or interpersonal justice. There are antecedents of engagement. These are the antecedents of engagement. The question remains on how trust and fairness and justice are to be built. Each are essentially processes of the quality of interactions between management and employees. McLeod and Clark recognise this and homed in on leadership, engaging managers, employee voice, and integrity. I agree with them completely, but I would give a lot more emphasis to employee voice, since it is a multifaceted activity, which is most obviously connected to the generation of trust, fairness, and procedural and informational justice. These days, virtually all the emphasis on employee voice is focused on direct communication and involvement through team briefing, workforce meetings, problem-solving groups, and to a much lesser extent via employee surveys. Employees get most information from their line manager, and well-run briefing group meetings allow for questions, discussion, and some dialogue. The good line manager will in any case spend time talking informally with their staff, for example in task allocation, problem solving, and work issues, especially coping with change. Procedural justice means understanding the need for decisions and why certain actions were necessary, as well as judging how fair they were. Explaining, sharing, and justifying takes place through dialogue or voice. There are limits, however, to how far direct communication and involvement can meet the requirement of informational justice. Top managers are out of the loop, and while they may use a wide array of communication methods, including social media, these are in the main top-down forms of communication. They do not give employees a voice. Collective consultation is curiously out of fashion, if it ever was in fashion, except during the Second World War. So too is partnership with trade unions, after a flurry of enthusiasm 10 years ago. But in both, the distinctive characteristic is senior managers briefing employee representatives on major plans and strategies and exploring the need for decision and especially working through the consequences of how best to ensure a fair and just implementation. This is where informational justice can be achieved. Mark Hall and I explore how this is done in our book, paying particular attention to the role of management in bringing big issues to the consultative committee or staff council, noting that many managers are reluctant to do so. Two other key activities are building an effective group of staff representatives able to forge a common purpose, and linking the staff council to the direct communication and involvement practices on the shop floor so they do not become isolated. Recently, Vince Cable, the Secretary of State for Business, otherwise known as Karl Marx of Twickenham, said in the House of Commons that information and consultation committees established under the ICE regulations are, quotes, a potentially powerful mechanism which has been underutilised to date. Well, he's right to say that they're potentially powerful and correct in noting that they're underutilised to date. He was quite wrong to suggest that ICE committees could debate executive pay. But that's another story. What he did not say was how the government intended to improve the take-up and work of ICE committees, which in theory employees can insist upon in every enterprise with 50 or more employees. This is not the place to tell him how government should strengthen the regulations, but Mark and I will send him a copy of the book, signed, which spells out, as well as explaining why the current regulations are inadequate. I hope you don't feel I'm digressing too far from my theme of employee engagement. The point here is that when embedded voice practices on the shop floor, led by frontline managers, coexist with top-level consultative committees run by senior managers, the effect on employee engagement and commitment is greater than each by themselves. What is more, I do not know of other initiatives with the same positive outcome. Employee voice really is important for organisational climate and engagement. What concerns me is how the cause of engagement can be advanced. We always have a problem of how to diffuse good practice in Britain. While I admire and support David McClelland and Nita Clark in their efforts to create a social movement promoting engagement, I have to be sceptical, having seen so many change initiatives fall away. And I do not think it is good enough for government to just give its blessing and then sit back and do nothing. Employee engagement is worth pursuing, not as an end in itself, but as a means of improving working lives and company performance. The evidence of positive business outcomes is as strong as you can get it, even if it's never conclusive. And employee engagement is a classic win-win initiative since it is associated, when done properly, with better employee well-being as well as wealth creation. It puts employees at the heart of the enterprise, since it is they who judge their managers for their fairness, trust, and acting with justice, and who in return work better in their job, cooperate in innovation and change, and support the organisation which employs them. As such, if we here ever doubted it, it returns employment relations to its proper place in business. Pat Lowry would have approved. Thank you.